Hey guys, good afternoon. Been a while, right? So this is going to be our lecture on 1863, Confederate high tide, then the tide turns. And what we're going to talk about in this lecture pretty much is the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Um, and those are really the principal parts of this lecture. We're going to talk about the sort of end of the term of George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside taking over command of the Army of the Potomac, um, his foibles, and with some help from Henry Halleck, and then the uh, the rise of Joe Hooker, fighting Joe Hooker to command of the Army of the Potomac, and Lee's defeat of Hooker at the Battle of Chancellorsville, which sort of sets up um, Lee's Gettysburg campaign. So this is going to be very much a military history, this lecture, specifically about the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia. Um, so to begin with, the first part here, I would just want to recap sort of where we left off with Lincoln in the summer of 1862, following McClellan's defeat in the 7 Days battles. Of course, Lee had driven McClellan's army, which was within earshot of the church bells of Richmond, of course, through a series of counterattacks that were very costly to the Confederate army, drove McClellan's army all the way down to Harrison's Landing, where they had just escaped after a pretty stunning defensive victory at the Battle of Malvern Hill that inflicted about 5,000 casualties on the Confederate army. Um, and it was at that point that Lincoln ordered McClellan's army removed from the peninsula and relocated. Um, Lincoln, you'll recall the Harrison's Landing letter, the July 7th, 1862 letter, which actually we read as a document from your reader, where McClellan sort of took it upon himself to dictate sort of larger war strategy to Abraham Lincoln in insisting from his sort of democratic political position that it was a war for union, advising Lincoln that slavery should not be touched in Virginia, that the war should not be made a war for slavery, and that the Union needed to be the focus of the war effort. Otherwise, troops might not want to fight, etc. Lincoln, of course, uh, doesn't listen to McClellan. After McClellan is removed from the peninsula, he's demoted. He was at that point general in chief of the army, sort of a commander in chief, but of course we know Lincoln as president was actually commander in chief. So, and you'll recall that in that letter, McClellan was soliciting Lincoln to make him a sort of general in chief, which is a really curious position to take after a failed campaign. But anyway, Lincoln will actually demote McClellan, who will retain command of the Army of the Potomac, um, but he will appoint Henry Halleck, Old Brains, as he was known, who had been in command in the Western Theater and was Grant's superior there. He brings Halleck east and appoints him as sort of uh, the primary commander for the Eastern Theater of Operations. So he also, after some victories that had taken place that you read about in the McPherson book along the Mississippi River, John Pope, who was a Kentuckian by birth, um, and John Pope had won a convincing victory at a key Confederate defensive position in the middle. It's a big island in the middle of the Mississippi River called Island Number 10. I guess that's what the Army Corps of Engineers or someone named it at some point. I'd have to look that up. But anyway, it was a sort of the last key defensive position before Memphis, and Pope had successfully captured this. So the idea was kicked around of putting Pope in charge in the East and elevating him in command, bringing him east. And Pope's name came up, and Pope Lincoln is said to have remarked, and I don't know if this quote was in the Ken Burns video that you may have watched, but he said the popes. Yes, I knew the popes back in Kentucky. They were all liars and braggarts. But I don't know any reason why A liar and a braggart couldn't be a good general. So he proceeds to bring Pope back to the Eastern Theater, puts him in charge of a newly created army called the Army of Virginia. And McClellan is sort of put in a secondary position, uh, subordinate to Pope. And he will be called upon to support Pope, but Pope will be calling the shots now, which of course is a huge blow to McClellan's considerable vanity, which you've been reading about. And we've talked about to some degree. Lincoln, after these moves, was now realizing that slavery, something drastic was going to be done, need to be done. Um, the Second Confiscation Act and Militia Acts were both passed that summer, which you read about. And he made his offer to the loyal slave states, right? So that was Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, what we call the border states. He called a number of border state delegates into the White House to discuss with them the question of compensated emancipation. He had made this offer previously, a number of months before, and he was flatly refused by the Confederate states, or excuse me, not by the Confederate states, by the border state representatives. Once again, Lincoln meets with them and impresses on them that the war is taking a particular complexion and turn that is going to require sterner measures from the federal government, that war aims are expanding, and that he essentially presents a veiled threat to the representatives from the border states, telling them that you really, and I'm, sort of just speaking to the text of Lincoln's comments, he says to them that essentially you really want to take my offer because we can compensate you right now financially for all of your slaves. And if you don't, we might see things coming where you're not going to be compensated. So he very much, in a veiled way, hints toward the fact that he's going to be looking at emancipation, and they have a chance to do it um, in a way that's going to recompense them. So he was hoping that if the border states would take him up on his offer, if they would accept compensated emancipation for their slaves, and this precedent for this had been done in the British Empire uh, when the British emancipated the slaves in the West Indies in the very early 1830s. 1831 or 33, I forget the precise date. But the planters of the British West Indies islands were compensated for their slaves by the British government. So there's historical precedent for this. Lincoln's trying it with the border states, hoping that the border states will accept this, and therefore the Confederate states, the states in rebellion, would therefore no longer have hope of getting the border states to enter on their side, and they might just give up the war. They might just see, okay, we have a shot of just getting um, compensated for our slaves. We're not going to get any further help at this point. Maybe if um, we just follow suit, do what the border states have done, we'll at least get our money for the slaves. But this, of course, doesn't work. The border states flatly refuse Lincoln. Um, they write their own sort of little manifesto um, outlining all the reasons that such a proposal is preposterous. They'll have no part of it, and they go storming off their own way. Um, it's at that point that Lincoln's mind is completely made up that he's going to look to emancipate slaves. He's going to do it, he's going to do it quickly. However, his cabinet members, particularly Secretary of State William Seward, advised him that it would not be a good idea to do that right now. That we continue to lose battles as we lose battle after battle in the Eastern Theater, the theater which we've talked about in classes, and of course the McPherson essay you read on the Saratoga that wasn't right. Say how the focus of the major press organs as well as European journalists and politicians is on the Eastern Theater, where the capitals are of the Union and Confederacy. Constant Union losses in that theater of operations in Virginia were Lincoln to pass an Emancipation Proclamation would look like desperation. It would look like the desperate act of a government on its way out the door. So Seward advises Lincoln to hold on, wait till we have a military victory, and then you can issue this from a position of strength. So, of course, late August, there's a disastrous battle, Second Manassas, which takes place the very last few days of August, 28th, 29th of 1862, where John Pope um, sort of clumsily uh, attacks Stonewall Jackson's troops, who are entrenched behind a cutout, still under construction railroad line. There was sort of just already sort of trenches and rifle pits provided for them. They're on the top of a ridge. Um, the Union assaults them again and again and again. Um, one of the Union commanders, John Porter, commander of the Fifth Corps, was ordered to attack Jackson's flank. Um, he did nothing. The reason was that actually Longstreet had moved up um, in front of Porter, so that it was impossible for him to get around Longstreet to Jackson's flank. However, um, Pope insisted that he attack. Um, Porter refused and did nothing. So that's one part of the story. So we find later that Porter is court-martialed and cashiered out of the army for failing to attack. The bigger story here was that George McClellan was not far away, a few, about a day's march away, um, and refused to come to Pope's aid at this battle. So McClellan had a corps of about 30,000 troops that he could have brought to the battle to reinforce and assist Pope in this battle. But he was happy to just hang out back in Washington, made no effort. I'm sorry, he was in Alexandria, Virginia, actually, across the river, made no effort to come to Pope's aid. And Lincoln had it in his mind that he actually wanted to watch Pope fail, that he was that bitter and vain over having been replaced by Pope, and intentionally just held his troops back, disobeyed orders so that Pope would fail. And fail Pope did, um, miserably, in fact. Union casualties at this battle were extremely high, somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,000. Um, I think there were 12,000 Confederate casualties. It was a very, very vicious battle, um, but a resounding Confederate victory. Um, so once again, the Union Army is on the retreat back north, um, along the same roads they were retreating along in June of 1861. Another humiliating defeat at the same Bull Run battlefield. Um, they fight a rear guard action at the Battle of Chantilly, where Stonewall Jackson attempts to sort of deal a death blow to the troops while they're on the retreat. The Union fights them off in a terrible, terrible thunderstorm. They're able to fight off the sort of follow-up rebel thrust at them. Um, at that same time, Lincoln has decided to move Pope, throws him out to Minnesota. So he sort of exiles him to the Minnesota territory to pacify Indian tribes out in that area. And he reappoints McClellan to command over the complaint of his cabinet members, which included new Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who was really, really opposed to this, as well as I believe was Gideon Welles and Secretary of the Navy, both of whom were Democrats like McClellan, but they had had enough of McClellan's do-nothing attitude. However, the troops were so demoralized after this battle, morale was so low between the failure of the 7 days when they were so close to Richmond, and then this disastrous defeat. So, and if you look back at McPherson, he'll tell you that at one point the Union Army was within 20 miles of Richmond. By the time the Second Battle of Manassas was over, the Confederate Army was within 20 miles of Washington. So it had been a complete turning of the tables. Lee had dubbed this with half the number of troops that the Union Army had. And the Union Army was completely demoralized. So, because of McClellan's ability to whip an army into fighting shape, Lincoln determines that he has to be reappointed to command, whether or not he had intentionally sabotaged Pope. So, a really interesting decision by Lincoln here. But he thought the morale of the troops required it. They hated Pope that much. They loved McClellan that much for all his failures. And he was the only guy that was going to possibly get them to fight. So, as you know, you watched the Ken Burns episode 3, Forever Free, which covered the events of the Battle of Fredericksburg. Robert E. Lee deciding to get his troops out of Virginia in September of 1862. This was for a number of reasons. The Maryland campaign, the failed Maryland campaign of Lee, although his army was completely exhausted, worn out, um, really needed to take a break. Um, the Union Army was demoralized and Lee smelled blood. So that was one reason. Another was the fall harvest was coming. The war had been fought almost entirely in Virginia at this point. His troops needed the food. The people of Virginia and the South needed the food. And so Lee wanted to move the fighting, move the campaigning out of Virginia to give the farmers of Virginia an opportunity to collect the harvest that was going to be critical to getting the army through the fall and winter months and spring months. Excuse me. So this was a very important logistical decision Lee was making. Over the protest of Jefferson Davis, by the way. Another factor playing into this was the fact that there was a campaign going on at that time by Sterling Price and by Kirby Smith in the Kentucky theater. Okay, so it was Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg had launched a simultaneous attack northward into the state of Kentucky, hoping to flip Kentucky to the Union. So Lee saw some merit to attacking Maryland, another slave holding loyal border state, in the hopes that perhaps these simultaneous drives into Kentucky and Maryland might convince the citizens of these states to join the Confederacy. And Lee was also hoping that after the smashing, and it would be the right word for it, smashing Confederate victory at Second Manassas, um, they felt that they were very close, perhaps, to getting French and English recognition of the Confederacy, diplomatic recognition. So they thought maybe one more big victory, and this one, out of Southern soil, but moving north into a Union state, a victory there might bring European intervention, possibly into the war, and secure Confederate independence. So it was a big roll of the dice. As we know, that didn't work out. George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac fought in what was one of the, at that time, the bloodiest single day in American military history, still is to this day. There were over 23,000 casualties, Union and Confederate, at the Battle of Antietam. It was a bloody mess. The three major areas of fighting, of course, were the cornfield, the sunken road, and the stone bridge. Really, one at the far left, one at the center, one at the far right of the battlefield. The Union fought the Confederates to a standstill. There may have been an opportunity to push Confederates, who had their backs to the Potomac River. McClellan may have had an opportunity to push them the next day and perhaps gain a complete and total victory, but he did not. Lee's army was able to slip across the Potomac River under cover of night, moved his army back into Virginia. McClellan did not pursue. Lincoln really got on McClellan, went to visit McClellan, insisted that he pursue Lee, but McClellan refused. And as Lincoln continued to tell McClellan that Lee's army was beat up, Lee's army was tired. This is the time to strike them. You have to take them out now. Your troops might be tired, but they have to be more tired. This is your chance to win a big victory. McClellan kept making excuse after excuse about why he wouldn't pursue Lee's army. So finally, moving now into the third part of this lecture here to talk about Fredericksburg. On November the 7th, finally, 4 months after the Harrison's Landing letter, Lincoln fires McClellan, basically just for being too slow and for letting Lee escape. So Ambrose Burnside, who had been the commander of the Union Ninth Corps up to this point, was appointed general in chief. Now, Ambrose Burnside is sort of an interesting guy. He's the guy who actually is famous for his stylized facial hair. It's actually from Ambrose Burnside that we get sideburns. That's actually where the name comes from. Um, Burnside had a good war record up to this point. He was a very good general at the divisional level and at the corps command level. However, he himself had reservations about himself being a general in chief, the commander of the Army of the Potomac. He himself had doubts about his own ability to fulfill this role, which is not a good starting point, right? So he didn't have much confidence in his own ability to be a good commanding general. He felt he was better in a supporting role to the commanding general. Nonetheless, he was the best available option, and he was put in charge. He had actually been offered this job before the Battle of Second Manassas, by the way, and had turned it down. So this time, Lincoln's like, "Come on, I need you to take it," and he takes the job. But he had admitted his own incompetence to lead a large army the size of the Army of the Potomac. We'll see later on down in Tennessee campaigns in a supporting role to Grant and Rosecrans how effective he actually could be subsequent to um, Fredericksburg when he was put back in that supporting role of the smaller force. He again returned to his level of effectiveness. Anyway, so Burnside is asked to decide upon a battle plan to defeat Lee's army. Um, Abraham Lincoln was not interested in capturing Richmond so much as he was in defeating Lee's army. He understood that that was the way to end the rebellion. You had to defeat Lee's army. Capturing a city meant nothing. Look at the American Revolution. The British captured New York, the British captured Philadelphia. What good did it do them? Philadelphia was the capital. As long as Washington's army was in the field fighting, okay, that was all that mattered, right? Napoleon conquered Moscow. That did him no good in his 1812 campaign. So he says to Burnside, capture and defeat Lee's army, capture and defeat the army. So Burnside's plan is a pretty simple, straightforward one. He proposes attacking the city of Fredericksburg, which was on the south bank of the Rappahannock River. Excuse me a second. That's Bucky outside, uh, letting everyone in the neighborhood know he's out there. Um, so the sort of scene of the fighting had really moved away from the peninsula where McClellan had tried to have the war fought out, and it had moved to a line along the Rappahannock River. And the Confederates, of course, were on the other side of the river, the Union Army moving south. So Burnside wanted to attack Fredericksburg, which was on the south bank of the Rappahannock. Now, this would require a river crossing in order to attack the town. But there was a railroad line running from, it originally run from Washington through Fredericksburg straight down to Richmond. So the plan of Burnside was to attack along that line. He had to first secure Fredericksburg as a new forward base of operations on the south side of the Rappahannock, and from there use the rail line to make his attack straight on down toward Richmond and attack Richmond again in this direction. So Lincoln wasn't really happy with this plan. He's unhappy with the plan because, again, here was a plan about capturing a city, not destroying Lee's army. But he agrees to it. He says to Burnside, "You know what? If you will move quickly, if you will get moving, if in other words, if you're not going to be a McClellan, if you're actually going to just do this, you're going to execute this, you're going to make it happen. You know what? Go for it." That's basically, if you're going to do something, I'll take that. And so Lincoln agrees to the plan, even though he's not thrilled with it, and gives Burnside the go ahead. At this point, Lee's army is divided. Okay, Longstreet's corps is near Culpeper, Virginia. Stonewall Jackson's corps is in the Shenandoah Valley, and So Lee's army is completely separated, his two corps. Remember that the Confederate army at this point is divided into two corps, one under Longstreet, one under Jackson. And they're many miles from each other at this point. And Burnside gets off to a really good start. He's making time. He covers 40 miles march in the first 2 days with that huge Army of the Potomac. So he's really covering some ground. He gets down to the Rappahannock River rather quickly and is poised actually to win a convincing victory if he can get across the river. The problem was that his superior, Henry Halleck, the general in chief, doesn't have the necessary pontoons at the site. Okay, so Halleck had been informed, okay, the plan had been reported to Halleck, the general in chief. He was going to handle the logistics of this for Burnside. As I mentioned, the attack required a river crossing. That meant a pontoon bridge had to be built by, well, there was no Army Corps of Engineers really per se at that time. There were sort of precursors to that in the Civil War. But those pontoons had to be at the river for Burnside to build the bridge and get across quickly. It didn't happen. And in fact, he was stuck there for almost 2 weeks waiting for Halleck to get the pontoons to him. In the meanwhile, the Confederates in Fredericksburg, see the army arriving at the river. They know what's up, and this gives Lee time that he didn't have, but which Halleck gave to him. So he had been pretty much caught with his pants down, with his army completely separated, and here was the real opportunity for Burnside, and it goes out the window. And this is why it's really important to understand that the Army of the Potomac, in many respects, was a hard luck army. This army had no luck. Um, Even at some points, its commanders had no luck. The Army of the Potomac is frequently criticized in the history books for having poor commanders. Certainly, their commanders had a lot of failures, but they also had a lot of just bad luck. And I can tell you that the Confederates had a lot of good luck. In many instances, their commanders failed too, and they just got away with stuff. And this is a case where bad luck for Burnside in this case because of a failure of his superior. So anyway, Burnside is stuck, anxiously waiting along the banks of the Rappahannock River while Lee is assembling his army at Fredericksburg. And by the time that Burnside is able to get his army across the river, in other words, by the time they can get the bridge built and begin to cross, Lee's got 75,000 troops behind Fredericksburg. So Fredericksburg, if you go into the town, you cross over the river, you go into the small town itself, but then there are heights beyond the town, sort of behind the town. If you're moving from north to south, what we would say beyond the town, there are considerable high ground back there. It's known as Marye's Heights, and the Confederates just simply put 75,000 troops up on this high ground behind the town. They sort of left the town to they left a little covering force in the town to sort of do a little fighting with the Union Army as it tried to come through, offered some opposition, but they were massed on the heights and on the flanks of the heights to cover the river fordings, in other words, where troops could try to cross at other points in the river. So they were really forcing the Union Army to funnel through the town, come through the town, and come up the hill and get them. And this was a recipe for disaster. The battle was finally fought on December the 13th. The Union Army came through the small town of Fredericksburg. The Confederate troops in the town, fought them. There was some actually sort of street fighting in the streets of Fredericksburg. But then a Confederate force cleared out. The Union had to come through the town, through some woods, cross a canal, and then after crossing a canal, cross a field, and then go up a very, very steep hill. The Union tried to cross the canal, the field, and the hill about 13 times. There were about 13 different assaults or 14 different assaults thrown up the hill at these Confederates. They had a gigantically wide open field of fire, artillery, rifle fire. It was like you couldn't miss. There was no cover for these Union troops. They attacked again and again and again. And in one day, the Union Army lost, the reports of casualties vary, but they lost somewhere between 10 and 12,000 troops in a vain attempt to take these heights. Um, Robert E. Lee himself was watching this carnage and just couldn't believe um, that the commander, Burnside, was continuing to try to take the Confederates off this hill. Um, and I believe he said, "It is well that war is so terrible, for we would grow too fond of it." In other words, war could be exciting, it could be thrilling. We could really, it's something we could really like if we didn't have to sit and endure, and in this case, watch horror like this, like our own men shooting the enemy down in these kinds of numbers. Um, so this was an unmitigated disaster for the Union Army, and eventually they're forced to retreat back across the river. So there's a pause now until late in January of 1863. So the Union Army at this point, the Army of the Potomac, I should say, goes into winter quarters and they headquarter at Falmouth, Virginia, where they go into their winter camp. They attempt to rest, get the wounded fixed up who can go back to battle, refit, resupply. And it's at that point that Burnside hits upon the very interesting idea of a winter campaign. Now, winter offensives are really unusual in warfare. We'll see that the Confederates will attempt one, Battle of Stones River, Tennessee. Um, but winter campaigns are very unusual because it is very difficult in warfare because of weather, particularly back in the days before paved roads were common. You had to move armies along roads, and they got muddy from winter rains and snow, and wagons and animals got stuck in the mud, and you really couldn't move, right? So and this just sort of became a custom in the First World War. Winter times were typically a time of ceasefire. Why was Hitler's Battle of the Bulge such a big surprise? Because it was a major winter offensive no one was expecting, right, in the Second World War. So um, good old Ambrose Burnside decides that the Union is going to have a surprise winter campaign, and he sets off in an attempt to surprise Lee's army on January the 20th, and runs into nonstop rains and sleet. Um, and his army is stuck in the mud, trying to move, um, making basically no progress every day as the men are knee deep in mud. Um, Finally, on January the 26th, Lincoln fires him at the end of what is come to be known in history as Burnside's quote unquote mud march. Okay, so Burnside's last campaign in the East was known as the Mud March, where he took his troops out in the mud for about 3 days, 4 days, and had to turn them around because he couldn't get anywhere. And probably just got a bunch of guys got pneumonia was probably the big result of this, and they lost horses and things like that, wagons, supplies. It was again another just incompetent disaster for the Army of the Potomac. So on January the 26th of 1863, Lincoln fires Burnside from command of the Army of the Potomac. He is actually, as I mentioned a little earlier, shipped west, where he will go back to a smaller level of command that he's better suited to in the Middle Tennessee Theater. And he's replaced by Joseph Hooker, who was a division commander who had been a division commander. I believe he was raised to corps level after that. He had been a division commander, I believe, at Antietam. And Hooker, Massachusetts guy, known as Fightin' Joe, was a brawler, was a drinker, was a frequented the brothels of Washington, D.C. He was a man with a reputation for hard living. However, he was a no-nonsense guy. He was a disciplinarian, and he whipped the army into fighting shape. And throughout the spring of 1863, Hooker did what McClellan himself was very good at doing, and that was make the Army of the Potomac a fighting force that could be proud of itself and that was ready to campaign and believed in itself. You'll recall the document you just read, and I think I wrote this in my comments to a few of you in our present forum, which I started reading last night, some of your early posts. The letter we read by Wilbur Fisk, who was the Union soldier from, I believe, was the Vermont regiment, talking about copperheads and the fighting spirit of the Army. And the fighting spirit of the Army that Wilbur Fisk is describing in that April 1863 letter is very much due to Joseph Hooker taking command. The demoralizations that they had experienced under the Popes, under the Burnsides, had been replaced by a new optimism that largely stemmed from Hooker's interactions with the men and his training of the men. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's a connection to that document through Hooker. So that brings us to our last part of the lecture today, and whenever you may watch it, hope you get what you need to get from it. We're going to talk about the Battle of Chancellorsville. That was really the one big battle that was fought in the Eastern Theater that spring, and it didn't come until May. So in the spring, both of the armies reorganized, as I mentioned. Hooker has been reorganizing and refitting and retraining the Army of the Potomac. Lee has been doing his best to do the same with the Army of Northern Virginia. We get into the later spring and the roads begin to dry. And when the roads begin to dry, that's when it's the time for active campaigning. Again, back in 17th, 18th, 19th century warfare, you wanted the roads to be dry before you began campaigning, so supply wagons and things like that weren't stuck in the mud, right? So Joseph Hooker goes on the march looking for Lee's army. He's got a 2-to-1 numerical advantage over Lee. And he brings his army through an area of Virginia, and you can look this up on the map or in your textbook, known as the Wilderness. A very horrible battle would be fought there a year later with Grant in command. And on April 29th, he begins to arrive in this area with a large number of troops. He's got about 95,000 troops. So his plan is to send 25,000 troops under General Sedgwick, who I believe commanded the 6th Corps, as I recall. And he sends Sedgwick to Fredericksburg to attack the town of Fredericksburg, secure that position, while he himself is going to take 70,000 troops, cross the Rappahannock River, and hit Lee on his left. So this is the plan. And then the idea would be that Lee would be caught between Sedgwick in Fredericksburg and Hooker hitting him on his left. So it was sort of a hammer and anvil sort of strategy that he was looking to imply, except in this case, the hammer would be much larger than the anvil. However, the anvil would be at the top of Marie's Heights, Fredericksburg. So it would be on the high ground. So Lee knows what's coming. He figures it out very quickly. He's got a lot of local intelligence. Obviously, they're fighting in Virginia. They're getting information. And Lee decides that he's actually going to be the one to hit Hooker. He's going to beat him to the punch. And this is one of the things that Lee was very good at, was keeping his opponents off balance, hitting them before they could hit him, showing up in a position that they weren't going to expect him in. Lee had an outstanding understanding of the topography, the terrain of Virginia. He had spent his entire life living there, as had many of his officers and men. And the citizens of Virginia were more than happy to offer any intelligence, information about shortcuts and things like that. In this case, information from a local resident about a shortcut through the wilderness a pretty much unknown road will play a major role in the Confederate victory here. So Lee leaves 10,000 troops at Fredericksburg under one of his divisional commanders, Jubal Early, Jubal, Jubal A. Early. He was a attorney before the war, and will be actually one of Lee's chief defenders in the voluminous post-war literature that's going to come out uh, in the later 19th century. So Lee divides his forces on May the 2nd in the face of a much, much larger enemy here. He leaves 10,000 at Fredericksburg. He takes the rest of his troops to confront Hooker. Now let's see. So that would be, let me do a little quick math here. 10,029. Yeah. So Lee's got about 11,000 or 12,000 troops, maybe closer to 15. He leaves 10,000. Well, so in total, he's got about 40, right? He leaves 10,000 at Fredericksburg, takes with him 15 and 30, about 45,000. Okay. Hooker's got about 95,000 total. So Lee takes about 40,000 to confront Hooker's 70 that Hooker's coming at him with, right? Lee keeps a very thin screen right in front of the enemy, about 15,000 troops. That's going to be the center of his line. In the meanwhile, he sends Stonewall Jackson another one of these long flanking marches that he begins to use Jackson for so commonly, as he did at Second Manassas. And with about 29,000 troops, um, Stonewall Jackson goes on this very long clockwise flanking maneuver around the Union right. Okay, again, we're looking from south to north. He's going around what would be the Union right, but it's the Confederate sort of left wheel, if you will. The Union Army sees Lee in their front, begins to attack him. So Hooker's got about 70,000 troops concentrated, and Lee is facing him with about 15,000. This is a very, very, very risky strategy, and it's very, very evocative of Napoleon's strategy at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, which is considered his masterpiece victory. And Chancellorsville is considered Lee's masterpiece. If you study the Battle of Austerlitz, Lee defeated the Russian and Austrian armies there by drawing them in to attack him while a bunch of his troops flanked around behind them and came up on them from the rear. And then they were all caught in between. And this is very similar to what Hannibal did to the Roman legions at the Battle of Cana, also in I believe it was 79 A.D. I think it was. But anyway, Lee begins to take the brunt of the assault from Hooker. Hooker's troops are getting their dander up. They think they're going to have an easy victory here. And then suddenly in the late afternoon, around 4:35 in the afternoon, here comes Stonewall Jackson's army crashing through the wilderness on top of Oliver Howard's 11th Corps, which was a lot of German American troops actually, and they just get steamrolled. And Jackson's army drives a couple of corps of the Union Army off the battlefield. The ferocity of their assault is so intense. They just come in like a steamroller, catching the Union on the flank, and they don't know what hit them. They really don't. They push them back. They're pursuing them until it's dark out. At which point they can't go any further. There's still some fighting in the dark, but they have to call it off to prevent friendly fire, and so that they can reorganize their lines. But Jackson wants to keep going. He doesn't want to stop. He thinks they can get a complete victory that night, and he's actually considering a night attack. So he moves forward with some of his staff, and they ride forward toward the front lines to try to reconnoiter. He wants to reconnoiter the ground on his own to get a better fix on his position and the enemy's position as he contemplates his night attack, and if not, what he might do the next morning. Going down a dark road at night, he comes across a detachment of very, very nervous Confederate pickets. So these are guys who are out on picket duty, basically watching the line, watching the roads, kind of like on a guard duty, you might say, at a forward outpost to make sure the enemy's not trying to advance. And here come these horses riding down the road. These are these jumpy soldiers from North Carolina. They mistake Stonewall Jackson and his staff for Union cavalry, and they begin firing. Um, some of the staff and Jackson himself are hit. Uh, the Confederates, soon the fighting stops when they realize they've been shooting their own troops. Then they find out they've just shot General Jackson. Jackson is shot through the arm. The bone is shattered in his right arm, I believe it was. Um, it had to be, so he's taken from the battlefield shot. Um, he's taken away. The battle will continue without Jackson. Ultimately, what happens to Jackson is his arm will be amputated. Um, However, he survives the surgery, but then contracts pneumonia and passes away from pneumonia a couple days later. So while the Confederacy will win the Battle of Chancellorsville, the loss of Stonewall Jackson, who was really critical to Lee's sort of offensive strategies, um, is huge to the way that Lee does business. And the results of that will be made pretty clear by the fact that the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg, we look at what ifs of history, and obviously, I'm wearing blue. I'm a Union guy, right? A Jersey guy, but we wonder what might the Battle of Gettysburg have looked like if Stonewall Jackson was still in command of the First Corps of the Confederate Army, or Second Corps. I'm sorry. So we won't know that, but it's interesting what if history anyway. So the next day, the Confederates resume the offensive. Um, the Union armies gathered around the Chancellor Mansion, sometimes called the White House there. It was like sort of a interesting little town, Chancellorsville. There was the Chancellor family, and it was Chancellorsville. And there was really just one big White House there. That was the family's property, and a lot of woods and railroads and turnpike going through, and a lot of woods, but not much to it. Really just a crossroads. It doesn't even deserve the term town. I've seen it referred to as a hamlet in literature. It's probably a good way to describe it. Anyway, Hooker has made this house his headquarters. The next day during the fighting, Confederates artillery, Hooker is out on the front porch of the house. Um, and he's observing the battle from this big porch of this big white house, and a Confederate shell hits the house and dislodges some of the masonry from the house, which falls down and hits Hooker on the head and knocks him out cold. Fortunately for Hooker, he wasn't killed. Nonetheless, he gets knocked out. When they finally revive him, they find he's not dead, but he's got a concussion. He doesn't know where he is. He's like the guy in the Snickers commercial who thinks he's Superman, right? So command of the army falls to a subordinate who decides not to attack. So, the Confederates are able to hold their position. And the Union is able to hold their position. On May the 5th, Sedgwick decides to attack in Fredericksburg, out on the far flank of where the fighting is taking place in Chancellorsville. Sedgwick is successful in driving Jubal Early's army out of Fredericksburg. So Sedgwick runs Jubal Early out of Fredericksburg and begins advancing on the Chancellorsville battlefield. So at this point, there's help coming. He's got 25,000 troops under Sedgwick. Well, he's lost a few in the fight for Fredericksburg, but he's got now a neighborhood of 23,000 troops moving in the direction of the Chancellorsville battlefield. So with the forces they had and the losses from the two sides, suddenly Hooker was going to have something like 70,000 troops against Lee's um, much, much smaller force at this point. But Hooker does nothing. Hooker's dazed. He won't give orders. People are saying, Sedgwick is coming, sir, should we attack? So that at that point, Lee would be attacked from two sides. He doesn't make a decision. He sends no reinforcements to help Sedgwick, and he doesn't call for an attack all along the line, which would mean all forces attack. Lee, at this point, was caught in the middle of these two forces. Between Sedgwick and Hooker, Hooker's complete army was 90,000 men. Lee had only 35,000 at this point, and he would have been caught in between. Hooker inexplicably retreats. He had a headache. He had had enough. Inexplicably, with a 3-to-1 advantage, Hooker retreats. And Lee wins what is considered the most brilliant victory by any general in the American Civil War. I don't necessarily agree with that, but the strategy he employed by dividing his force and sending the much larger part of his force on the flanking march to attack with Jackson was considered a masterstroke of tactics. I don't think it's the greatest victory of the Civil War or the best job of generalship. If Hooker were halfway competent, Lee never would have got away with any of this. In fact, his whole force would have been destroyed, sandwiched in the middle of 90,000 troops. Beyond that, all afternoon, out on that right flank of the Union Army, reports had been coming in of Confederates out in the woods, Confederate activity in the wilderness, Rebs in the woods. And no one would send these reports up channels of command. They were ignored. They were seen as panicky troops, scouting party. And no one took the reports of Confederate movement in the woods out on the Union right flank seriously. So there were real failures by the commanders out on that front to take that threat seriously. There was a failure to report that threat up command so that it would be taken seriously, or to reinforce that, to dig defensive positions out there because these guys were caught in camp, like in other words, sitting around eating their dinner when they got attacked, sitting in their tents. So that was a major failure. And then, of course, allowing Lee to escape when completely sandwiched was a major failure too. So Lee pretty much got away with murder at Chancellorsville. And again, this is a case where sometimes you're good and sometimes you're lucky. And in this case, Lee was kind of good and very lucky. And the Union was not very good and was not very lucky. And that's how the Battle of Chancellorsville turned out. So at this point, Abraham Lincoln, of course, had some decisions to make. He's extremely discouraged. Hooker is immediately fired as commander of the Army of the Potomac after this. And Lincoln has a decision on his hands of who he's going to appoint. And it's at this point now that Robert E. Lee decides he's going to start building on this sort of seminal victory in his career at this point. And he decides that the thing to do is to attack the North on their own ground again, sort of repeat the failed Maryland strategy, and this time attack Pennsylvania. And this is, of course, going to result in a major battle within 2 months, at the beginning of July at Gettysburg. So we're going to stop right there. I asked if you would watch episode 5 of the Ken Burns series, that is the Universe of Battle, and that will cover the events of the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and then your lecture on 1864 and Grant's campaigns in, Tennessee, and then Eastern Virginia are all covered in that lecture, which I've already posted all the notes for in our Sakai site. So glad you guys are really sticking at this. I've appreciated your level of activity. I'm going to get to reading your posts in the Sakai forum and responding to you on that stuff over this weekend. Um, and now that I'm all caught up on grading, I'm gonna, appreciate you guys' patience as we did this sort of simultaneous changeover and grading. There was a lot for me to get caught up on to convert these classes online and then get all that grading done too. So we'll be much more in connection moving forward. I might experiment with a technology called Big Blue Button. We had a history department meeting today. Professor Epstein said she was using that with some success. So I'm going to look into that a little bit to see if we can make some of these um, lecture and discussions a little more interactive. So I'm going to see if I can learn something about that technology. So listen, you guys have a great weekend. Okay, be strong, be safe, be smart, be leaders. Love you guys. Be good.